In recent weeks, we've watched a lot of political pushing on both sides, back and forth, and arguing, if you will, about the Iran deal, the Iran nuclear deal that the president pushed so hard for. And many critics say is, well, not worth the paper it's written on, and will lay the groundwork for Iran to get its hands on a nuclear weapon, maybe not today, but in the fairly near future. We're also now releasing, what is it, $130 to $150 billion, and apparently we're also paying interest. Interest in other monies, well over $1 billion for the money that we've held on to. That, to me, I find that just wildly offensive, that part, because, listen, are we wrong to conclude that Iran is involved in stirring up political problems and being a state sponsor of terrorism? These are all concerns. Our next guest may be the most well-versed person there is, period, when it comes to Iran and what goes on there. Dr. Raymond Tanter, our next guest. Doctor, welcome back to the program.
Thank you, Steve Gruber. It's always a pleasure to be back with Michigan, and I know you'll be on Facebook and podcasting and all around the world.
Yeah, well, we'll do all of those things. I understand you have a new book, and I want to mention that first, right off the top, Islamist Movements, Protégés of the Ayatollahs. And so as we look around, I mean, whether it's, we haven't talked in some time, so things have happened, like San Bernardino has occurred.
Right.
The attacks in Paris have occurred since we last talked. And then I look at what's going on with this deal that President Barack Obama has pushed so hard to push through, and then we're releasing $150 billion back to, I guess, in effect, the Ayatollahs, if I'm not wrong that way. As you look at Iran today, well, what concerns you the most of all of the things that are going on?
Well, Steve, to take off on what you just said, Iran is on a roll with the lifting of sanctions, and the Obama administration is being rolled. The administration is living in a fantasy land of make-believe. First, Iran isn't a normal state like Japan. It wouldn't matter if Tokyo goes nuclear. But it does matter if Iran goes nuclear, because Iran is a revolutionary state, not a normal state. And in addition, Iran is a state that cheats. As we know from the revelations by the main Iranian opposition group that rejects terrorist clerical rule in Iran, Iran has cheated in the past and has been caught, and the international community knew about it because of the role of the National Council of Resistance Iran in exposing this information. So I worry about the fact that Iran will get the sanctions money. The administration is living in a fancy land, and Iran will cheat, and the inspections that are put forth are not sufficient to detect the cheating, because Iran will play a major role, if you will, Steve, in the inspections process.
Well, right. One of the things that this administration demanded and said was not up for negotiation when they went into this conversation about containing nuclear weapons and so forth was anytime, anywhere inspections. Well, that got cast aside, as did so many other things along the way. And I don't know what the administration's goal is here, because at the end of the day, people say, well, how long will it take Iran to get a nuclear weapon? The longest time frame that I've seen, Doctor, is 15 years.
Right. Well,
what good is that?
No, the shortest time, you're right, there's a long and a short. The shortest time was in 12 months. And the longest time would be in 10 to 15 years. And Iran plays what is called the long game. Long game means that, look, we're part of a long-time culture, the Persian culture, and we think in terms of centuries, where you think in terms of decades.
Right.
And the administration, with all due respect, says, look, they could have gotten a bomb within 3 months. But that's not very reassuring either. So I look back and I look beyond. And, yesterday what was yesterday? The anniversary of the inaugural address of whom? President Ronald Reagan.
Reagan.
On January 20th, 2016. Now, as a participant in his campaign and his White House, I fondly recall Reagan's words. I was, in fact, at the inaugural address. He said that government is not the solution to our problem. Government is the problem. So likewise, Steve, the Islamic Republic of Iran is not the suitable partner for the Obama administration to destroy the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, because the heart of militant Islam, and this takes off on the book that I'm finishing, the heart of militant Islam beats in Tehran. Iran cannot be a part of the solution. It is the problem, Steve.
And so why? Okay, so here's one of my questions, and maybe you can help me with this. Valerie Jarrett is arguably the key advisor to the president over his entire presidency, who holds more sway over the president than anybody else. Born in Tehran in 1953, Valerie Jarrett was. Is that some impact? Is that the motivating influence on the president when it comes to the Muslim Republic, Islamic Republic, that is, of Iran?
Well, Steve, with all due respect again, the president is the commander-in-chief, and it's his administration. So Valerie Jarrett is a best friend of the First Lady and of the President. She introduced the two of them and hired one of them. I can't remember which one she hired. So they owe her, but the responsibility lies in the Oval Office where she sits.
Well, yeah.
But
she sits every day.
I don't blame her.
All right. I was just saying.
How much time do we have? Hard break coming up?
We got plenty of time. We got a minute and a half before the break.
Okay, good. Well, I'm looking at, going forward, I look at something called the Zero Tolerance of Terrorism Act, which is making the rounds on Capitol Hill. And I think that, plus the imposition of the new sanctions by the administration, will go a long way in telling the Iranian regime that even this administration is serious about making sure that there are no additional nuclear ballistic missile tests, ballistic missiles that can carry nuclear devices in miniaturized form, and diverting funds from the sanctions to prop up Bashar Assad for the purposes of achieving the Iranian regime's objectives in Syria.
You know, and I want to touch on that when we come back, so if you could bear with me there, Doctor. Dr. Raymond Tanter here, maybe the leading voice you can find today when it comes to Iran, Iranian issues, and everything that's going on in that part of the world, in the tensions between Iran and Saudi Arabia. We'll talk about that. We'll talk about the supply depots filled with ICBMs to the point that they had to, find another place to store them. We'll talk about all of that straight ahead with Dr. Raymond Tanter right here on the Steve Gruber Show. Welcome back to the Steve Gruber Show. Our guest this hour, Dr. Raymond Tanter, one of the foremost experts when it comes to Iran and the Middle East, has a new book out, The Islamist Movement's Proteges of the Ayatollahs. And Doctor, as I look at what Iran is doing, and I can point to the 2 U.S. Navy boats that they apprehended and put 10 sailors on their knees, took photographs of them with their hands clasped behind their heads, chucking missiles out towards, I believe it was Harry S. Truman in international waters. And the Obama administration, we thank them for letting our sailors go. I mean, it gets to a point that it is so absurd and offensive to me, because then I reflect on, and you say you sat at the first inauguration of Ronald Reagan, and I contrast strength to weakness, and I guess to me it's very upsetting.
Well, there's no question that we have the power, the strength. At issue, Steve, is whether we have the resolve, the commitment, and I think that at some point the administration does have some credibility, which, as I mentioned before the break, the administration has imposed new sanctions on Iran with respect to ballistic missiles, and has taken actions to work on this issue of the terrorism that the Iranian regime through Bashar Assad is wreaking havoc with, in combination with the Russians in Syria. So you have to give the administration its credit sometimes. You sometimes put me in a position where I'm defending the administration, but as an analyst...
and that's fair.
I have
what
to
you're saying is fair. No, what you're saying is fair, and we give credit where credit's due, and that's fair. And I'm not always aware of as much of the information clearly as you are. You spend a lot of time on that side of the street, and that's obviously why we have you here. But let me ask you this: you talk about Iran propping up Bashar al-Assad in Syria. Your opinion, and this is your opinion. I believe that maybe we should just leave Assad there, because if you don't, you create another vacuum in the Middle East. It can be taken up by the likes of an ISIS or a Boko Haram or pick your poison type, group that would come in. What do you think we should do with Bashar al-Assad?
Well, there's a group in Israel that says the same thing. Leave Assad there, because the devil you know is better than the devil you don't know, and he's surely a devil.
Yeah.
And there is the Democratic minority member of the House Armed Services Committee, who is an Iraq veteran, takes this view as well. Leave the devil there. But I don't think that's a position that Ronald Reagan would have taken. I think that the Bashar has to go. The issue is, how does he go? And I would say that John Kerry and Lavrov may hold the solution in their hands by negotiating a deal where the opposition groups that are in Syria, that we support and that the Saudis support, will attend the same conference with the groups that Assad and the Russians and the Iranians want. So that's the negotiation going on as we speak today.
I think the difference, and you point out that it's not what Ronald Reagan would do, and you're probably right, but see, the difference, the stark contrast to me, is that we wouldn't have left the void in Iraq either. Ronald Reagan wouldn't have, pulled out all the forces and said, look, we're done with the war, isn't that great, wash our hands of it and walk away, because that created that vacuum.
True,
most would say that.
You remember that the war had gone on for quite some time. It wasn't just a political ploy on the part of the administration. It was really time to make some kind of a move out of Iran.
My point being this,
15 years in Afghanistan, I could say the same thing. That said,
my point is this,
correct,
though.
Steve, in saying that there was a void, and the void was quickly filled by the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria's predecessor, called the Islamic State of Iraq. So there was a mistake.
The point that I'm making is simply this. I'm simply saying that if you took I'm simply saying if Assad was to be removed in whatever fashion, we would have to do. We couldn't just leave it up to the to the whims of political parties of the Middle East to see what happens next, could we? That's what I'm saying could be potentially dangerous for us. We would have to be more mindful of what happens if Assad were removed.
It is true. Now, you also mentioned before the break something about the supply chain.
Yes.
Right. You want to go into that? Now, Iran has a supply chain. That's the covert system used to circumvent global sanctions and procure materials and equipment. And yes, go ahead.
So how do we interject in that? We've got about a minute and a half here at the most, Doctor. And so, how do you interrupt the supply chain? That's a great point.
Yeah, well, the transparency measures announced after the talks in Switzerland at best could detect the quantitative excesses at known locations, but not the secret illegal activities, such as those that Iran carried out on a large scale in violation of its obligations under the nuclear test ban treaty. So you have to make sure that groups like the National Council of Resistance of Iran are constantly on the lookout. Why? Because they are people who put their lives on the ground in Iran. They're the ones who have the best eyes on hand, whereas we depend too much on electronic and satellite intelligence. You need to marry those insights from the sky with the insights on the ground, Steve.
We need a lot more human intelligence, is what you're saying, Doctor.
There you go.
And again, the book, the book is Islamist Movements, Protégés of the Ayatollahs. And Doctor, you know so much that, it always feels like even when we spend half an hour talking about it, that I'm missing a lot. But I appreciate the time as always, and hopefully we'll talk sometime soon.
Go blue, go green.
There you go. Dr. Raymond Tanter.